I always dreamed of retiring from the stress of city life and settling somewhere peaceful. After decades spent in Washington, D.C., working my way through federal agencies and culminating in my current post as director of the National Safety Board, I yearned for a quieter environment, a place where neighbors chatted over white picket fences, kids played safely in cul-de-sacs, and the biggest drama might be who forgot to take the trash out. That's how I ended up buying a modest single-family home in Hillcrest Oaks, a suburban community on the outskirts of a bustling Midwestern city. The real estate brochure boasted tree-lined streets, a picturesque pond at the center, and a homeowners association, HOA, that supposedly kept everything tidy. Perfect, I thought. A stable neighborhood to enjoy with my two rescue dogs, Toby and Scout. Little did I know that the HOA's vice president, a middle-aged woman named Cynthia Hopkins, though everyone privately called her Karen, would wreak havoc with a single, reckless move, cutting off the community's gas lines in the dead of winter. She had no idea that, in doing so, she was clashing with me, the head of a federal organization overseeing transportation and utility safety. Her short-sighted, vindictive actions would plunge the neighborhood into crisis and lead to her dramatic downfall. My first days in Hillcrest Oaks felt idyllic. I arrived in late October, the leaves turning brilliant shades of orange and gold. Neighbors waved as I unloaded boxes from a moving truck. One older couple brought me an apple pie, introducing themselves as Ron and Marjorie. Another neighbor, Caroline, who had two energetic teens, offered to show me around the local shops and restaurants. All the while, people pointedly cautioned me about our Karen, whispering stories of her imposing fines for minor infractions, like a porch light bulb that didn't match the HOA's color scheme or a decorative wreath too large for the front door. They said she was the real power behind the board, overshadowing the nominal president, Mr. Daniels, who seemed timid next to her forceful personality. I brushed off these warnings, figuring every HOA had at least one stickler. My job at the National Safety Board had me traveling frequently to investigate accidents, monitor compliance, and guide national safety regulations. I wanted to be a low-key neighbor, not announcing my position or throwing weight around. So I politely resolved to keep my head down and meet Karen on neutral ground, hoping we could coexist. That introduction came soon enough. On a crisp Saturday morning, as I was raking leaves, a petite woman with sharp features and perfectly coiffed hair strolled up my driveway, wearing a tailored coat despite the mild temperature. "You must be the new resident," she said with a tight smile. "I'm Cynthia Hopkins. People sometimes call me Karen. I'm the vice president of the Hillcrest Oaks HOA. I wanted to personally welcome you and ensure you've reviewed our rules. We maintain very high standards here." She handed me a thick packet labeled Hillcrest Oaks Covenants and Restrictions. I thanked her, and she nodded stiffly. "We have a certain look to preserve: uniform mailbox designs, lawn upkeep, and so forth. If you have any questions, bring them to me. We can't afford anyone lowering property values." Her condescending tone grated, but I remained polite. "Thank you for the info. I appreciate it. The neighborhood is beautiful, and I'm happy to follow the guidelines." She had my half-raked lawn. "Ensure you bag those leaves promptly. We don't want debris blowing onto other properties." Then she pivoted and strode off, not waiting for a farewell. I stood there, rake in hand, feeling uneasy. Something about her manner suggested she thrived on control. But I shrugged, focusing on the fact that her demands seemed ordinary, strict, yes, but standard for HOAs. Surely it won't get out of hand. I had no idea just how wrong that assumption would be. In the weeks that followed, I noticed Karen's presence everywhere. She drove slowly around Hillcrest Oaks in her gray SUV, scanning for any sign of noncompliance. Sometimes she'd stop, exit the car, and snap photos of a homeowner's lawn or porch. Neighbors groaned at her vigilance. If your driveway had a single leaf, you might get a note in your mailbox politely reminding you of the landscaping rules. When winter approached, her crusade expanded. She insisted on uniform holiday decorations, threatened fines for excessive lights, and policed the direction of everyone's inflatable snowmen. But these were trifles compared to what was brewing beneath the surface. I started hearing rumblings that Karen was pushing for new safety standards regarding the neighborhood's gas lines. Hillcrest Oaks was built decades ago, and a portion of the homes were on a shared system feeding into each house. The utility company oversaw general maintenance, but Karen apparently wanted more control, claiming the lines were unsightly or inconvenient. At an HOA meeting, I overheard her telling Mr. Daniels that the lines should be buried deeper or removed altogether, though that made little sense from an engineering standpoint. Others were uneasy. "Isn't that the utilities jurisdiction?" asked Linda, a neighbor who taught elementary school. "We can't just meddle with gas lines, can we?" Karen brushed off the concerns. "We'll handle it. The board will discuss solutions. Our property values matter." I tried to ask a question about the HOA's relationship with the local gas utility, but Karen dismissed me, saying, "You're new here, so you probably don't know all the background. Let the board handle it." That was my first inkling she might do something rash, unencumbered by professional guidance. Given my job, I knew how dangerous tampering with gas infrastructure could be. But I still believed she wouldn't cross that line. Maybe she'd talk to the city or push for some superficial changes. My focus was on quietly enjoying the holiday season, not suspecting that Karen would soon attempt a near-criminal stunt. December descended on Hillcrest Oaks with early snowfalls, turning lawns into glistening white patches. The air turned frigid, and most neighbors cranked up their heaters to stay cozy. Meanwhile, at each monthly HOA meeting, Karen kept harping on excess lines near the houses. She repeatedly used phrases like, "This place looks like a utility jungle," or "We need aesthetic cohesion." I wanted to step in to caution her that any modification to gas lines required professional inspection, permitting, and utility coordination. But with traveling for the National Safety Board investigations, I missed a key HOA gathering. By the time I returned, the rumor mill said Karen had convinced the board to pass a motion for a gas line improvement project, though details were vague. Some neighbors told me they got a letter from the HOA claiming the lines would be adjusted to meet new aesthetic standards, with an unspecified contractor hired by the board. This set off alarm bells. Gas lines aren't some trivial landscaping feature. One slip could cause leaks, explosions, or major supply outages. I tried to corner Karen for an explanation, but she was elusive. She posted a notice on the online forum. "The HOA is taking steps to streamline our utility lines, removing outdated or unsightly pipes. Residents will be informed once the project is complete. We appreciate your cooperation in making Hillcrest Oaks more visually appealing." Visually appealing? I muttered, concerned. At what cost? Some neighbors shrugged, trusting the board. Others were anxious. The local utility hadn't sent any official notices, which was odd. Typically, they'd coordinate with homeowners about any plan modifications. This was all under the banner of the HOA. That's when I decided to quietly check with the city's building department. After a phone call, I learned there were no permits filed for gas line modifications in Hillcrest Oaks. A sinking feeling took hold. Is Karen forging ahead without proper authorization? I resolved that next time I saw her, I'd demand clarity. But events overtook me faster than expected. One frosty evening in mid-December, I heard noises outside around midnight, muffled clangs and footsteps. Toby, my dog, barked uneasily. Peeking from my window, I glimpsed silhouettes moving near the gas line behind my house. My heart jolted. Could this be the contractor Karen hired? I threw on a coat and ventured outside. A pair of men in dark jackets were fiddling with the metal piping leading to my gas meter. I flashed my porch light on them. "Excuse me, what's happening here?" They turned, startled. One held a wrench, the other a small hacksaw. "We're from the HOA," said the first man, obviously lying through his teeth. "We're removing some redundant piping as part of the new aesthetic plan." Redundant piping? I repeated, astonished. That's a live gas line. You can't just hack it out. The second man scowled. "We have Ms. Hopkins's permission. She said it's safe. We'll be done soon." My jaw dropped. Karen told them it's safe? This was beyond incompetent. It was potentially lethal. Furious, I demanded they stop, threatening to call the police. The men muttered curses, but eventually packed up and left. Before they drove away, they hissed that the rest of the neighborhood's lines were already done. My stomach churned. How many lines had they messed with tonight? Within minutes, I checked my thermostat. The heat still worked. Apparently, they hadn't fully cut mine. But what about the others? I texted a few neighbors. No immediate responses. Perhaps they were asleep. Worried, I spent the night in anxious vigil. If lines were tampered with, a leak could cause an explosion or carbon monoxide infiltration. Or they might have severed supply entirely, dooming us to freeze in sub-zero weather. At dawn, the grim truth emerged. Multiple houses reported their heat was out, the gas lines apparently disconnected. Others smelled faint gas odors near the pipes. Panic swept Hillcrest Oaks. People threw on layers of clothing. Some families fled to relatives' homes. The local utilities' phone lines jammed with calls for emergency repair. What the heck happened? Neighbors cried. The answer: Karen happened. Word spread that a shadowy crew, likely not licensed professionals, had come in the night and physically removed segments of piping from various homes. At some places, they left gaping holes in the ground. At others, they crudely capped lines to stop leaks. The outcome: dozens of residences had no functional gas supply in the heart of winter. Temperatures hovered below freezing, and with space heaters limited, it was a dire situation. Karen was nowhere to be found that morning. The HOA phone line rang endlessly. Furious neighbors banged on her door, but she didn't answer. The fiasco triggered a wave of frantic calls to the city gas utility, which dispatched emergency crews. They found extensive, unauthorized tampering. Fire trucks rolled in too, concerned about the risk of residual leaks or potential blasts if any line was improperly sealed. My National Safety Board instincts went into high gear. Gas line sabotage was a major hazard. I called in a personal favor from a contact in the local fire marshal's office, letting them know we had a serious situation. Officially, the National Safety Board typically deals with transportation safety, but we also weigh in on pipeline incidents, particularly if there's any interstate pipeline. While these are local lines, it wasn't out of scope for me to share expertise or coordinate with relevant agencies. By noon, news trucks arrived, capturing footage of cold, distraught residents. Someone pinned the blame on HOA decisions. Rumors swirled that Karen personally directed the removal to improve curb appeal. Outrage soared. People demanded her arrest. If a single spark met a leaking line, we could see catastrophic damage. The entire fiasco dwarfed any typical HOA annoyance. This was a life-threatening crisis. Late that afternoon, Karen finally emerged from her house. She posted a notice on the community forum. The HOA regrets the inconvenience caused by last night's line improvement project. We will arrange for replacement solutions soon. This measure was necessary to remove outdated, ugly piping. We appreciate your patience. Inconvenience? That was an outrageous understatement. Families shivered in unheated homes, reliant on borrowed space heaters or hotel stays. Anger boiled. A group of neighbors confronted her on her driveway, demanding answers. She claimed the lines were redundant or unnecessary, and that she had a private contractor's advice proving it was safe. She insisted the city utilities' reaction was exaggerated and that everything would be fixed quickly. Her arrogance was breathtaking. I stepped forward among the crowd. Ms. Hopkins, do you realize you endanger people's lives? Cutting gas lines can cause explosions, carbon monoxide poisoning. These lines are not just for show. You had no authority to do this. Her eyes narrowed. I beg your pardon, Mr. She paused, not recalling my name. I'm the HOA vice president. We have every right to manage external elements on our properties. The lines were aesthetically displeasing and outdated. My contractor assured me it was fine. A cry rose from the neighbors. You hired incompetent hacks. We have children freezing in these houses. How can you call this improvement? Karen raised a hand for silence, doubling down. I know what's best for Hillcrest Oaks. Once we get the new lines installed, tastefully hidden, I might add, this minor disruption will be forgotten. Don't blow this out of proportion. My blood boiled. The city's utility reported that it could take days, maybe weeks, to fully restore safe gas service, given the extensive damage. Meanwhile, temps were plummeting. This wasn't a minor disruption. It was a full-blown crisis. People glared at Karen, some threatening lawsuits. She seemed unbothered, as though we were all being overly dramatic. At that point, I decided to escalate. Enough was enough. If she wanted to challenge public safety, she'd find out exactly who I was and who would hold her accountable. The question was how to do it without turning the neighborhood into a media circus. But the media was already on the scene, so perhaps going public was the only path. While neighbors huddled in shock, local news reporters roamed the community. They interviewed residents shivering in thick coats, filming the half-dug trenches and cut pipes. Some recognized me from prior coverage of national pipeline accidents or major transit investigations. Approaching me, a reporter asked, "Excuse me, aren't you Dr. Danielle Morgan from the National Safety Board? We've seen you on press briefings about pipeline safety." I hesitated, then nodded. It was out now. I admitted. I live here in Hillcrest Oaks. The reporter's eyes lit up. Can you comment on the severity of this unauthorized gas line removal? Given the gravity, I decided to speak candidly. This was a reckless act with serious implications. Tampering with gas infrastructure without proper permits or professional oversight is extremely dangerous. People could be injured or killed in the event of a leak or explosion. Also, the sudden lack of heating puts vulnerable residents at risk in freezing temperatures. The camera rolled. The reporter probed, "Does this fall under the National Safety Board's jurisdiction?" I explained carefully. Typically, local pipeline distribution lines are regulated by state or municipal authorities. However, the NTSB can investigate pipeline incidents that pose significant hazards. If the city or state requests our involvement, or if this meets certain thresholds, we may open an investigation. At the very least, I'll share my expertise to help the relevant agencies handle this safely. Word spread fast that the new neighbor was actually the head of the National Safety Board. Gasps and stares abounded. Some neighbors cheered, believing Karen was about to face serious consequences from a top federal official. Others worried about the negative attention overshadowing the immediate fix needed for our homes. I assured them the priority was restoring safe heat, but yes, an investigation was likely. Karen was in deep trouble. She, however, responded with defiance. That night, she posted on the HOA forum, "No matter who claims to be in charge of safety, the HOA stands by our improvement plan. We have every right to remove obtrusive lines. The city utilities meltdown is an overreaction, and so is any so-called federal meddling." She ended with a jab. "We don't need a national board telling us how to run our neighborhood." The gall. My jaw dropped reading that. The line between arrogance and criminal negligence had blurred entirely for her. The city declared a local emergency in Hillcrest Oaks due to widespread heat loss. Utility crews worked around the clock to assess the damage. Meanwhile, the local building inspector found no record of a permit for line removal. The so-called private contractor Karen hired was nowhere to be found, likely unlicensed. The inspector recommended a thorough probe, and the fire marshal's office, along with the state's pipeline regulatory agency, requested assistance from my department, the National Safety Board. Thus, a formal federal-state investigation launched. My team arrived with specialized pipeline experts. While I tried to avoid direct involvement, to avoid a conflict of interest, since I was personally affected, I oversaw the high-level coordination. The objective: identify who authorized the sabotage, how it was carried out, and ensure no further hazards remained. Karen refused to cooperate initially, ignoring calls from inspectors, claiming I did nothing wrong. But the mounting pressure wore on, with cameras capturing weeping families who spent nights in frigid conditions. Public sentiment skewed heavily against her. News headlines blasted. HOA official cuts gas lines, endangers residents, National Safety Board probing neighborhood sabotage, and so forth. At an emergency HOA meeting convened by the outraged president, Mr. Daniels, Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she had verbal support from the board to beautify the lines. Mr. Daniels retorted that no one approved physically severing them. The board members declared that any mention of improvement was about exploring burying lines with the utilities' help, not forcibly removing them overnight. The tension soared, with neighbors demanding Karen's resignation, potential lawsuits, or even criminal charges. She attempted to deflect blame onto the phantom contractor. They misunderstood me, but few believed it. One frosty morning, I found Karen standing outside her house, arms folded, scowling at the swirl of activity. Utility trucks beeped in reverse, digging up broken lines. Families with small children trudged by, carrying blankets to their cars, planning to stay elsewhere. The heartbreak was palpable. I approached Karen calmly. "We need to talk," I said softly. "Your actions have real consequences. People are freezing. The city might press charges if the investigation confirms criminal negligence." She jutted her chin out. "I never intended to harm anyone. I just wanted to fix the neighborhood's ugly infrastructure. Those lines were old, and the contractor insisted it was safe to remove them. Why is everyone acting like I'm a monster?" "Because you circumvented professional processes," I replied. "You didn't consult the utility, didn't get permits. You hired unqualified workers to do a job that's extremely dangerous. Gas lines aren't decorative, they're critical for heating." Karen's eyes flashed with anger, but then I saw a flicker of fear. She looked around at the chaos, the cameras, the furious neighbors. I thought it would be quick. Replace them with new, hidden lines. Everyone would thank me later. Then the contractor vanished. The situation spiraled. "It's not that simple," I said gently. "You owe the entire community an apology, at least, and restitution for repairs. The authorities will determine if you face legal penalties. Meanwhile, the National Safety Board is assisting the state pipeline agency. We'll find out exactly what happened." She swallowed hard. "But can't you do something? You're the top official. Can't you tell them it was an accident, that I had good intentions?" My expression hardened. "I can't shield you from accountability. My duty is public safety. I'll ensure a fair investigation, but the facts speak for themselves." She trembled, tears threatening. "I never meant. I just wanted them hidden from sight." I stepped back. "I suggest you cooperate fully with investigators, help pay for the damage, and step down from the HOA. That's your best path to redemption." Karen sank onto her porch step, speechless, face pale. The unstoppable wave of consequences was upon her. Meanwhile, the practical fallout hammered Hillcrest Oaks. Extended heat loss. The utility estimated at least a week or more before gas service could be restored to all homes due to extensive pipe damage. Families either endured cold nights with borrowed electric heaters or found temporary lodging with friends, hotels, or shelters. Skyrocketing costs. Each house needed an inspection and reinstallation of proper lines. The utility threatened to bill the HOA for tens of thousands of dollars. Lawyers circled, hinting at a class action suit from residents seeking compensation for hotel stays, property damage, or emotional distress. Reputation hit. The once charming Hillcrest Oaks made national headlines for all the wrong reasons. HOA officials sabotages gas lines. Property values ironically plummeted. Karen's greatest fear ironically realized by her own hand. Potential buyers backed off, spooked by the fiasco. Neighbors vented heartbreak. "My kids are missing days of school," complained a father. "We're couch surfing," said another. Some demanded an immediate recall vote to remove Karen from a board. President Daniels, outraged, scheduled an emergency membership meeting. Meanwhile, investigators interviewed residents, collecting statements about the midnight operation. The evidence pointed to Karen orchestrating the entire scheme with a shady contracting crew. As conditions worsened, local officials even considered declaring Hillcrest Oaks a disaster zone to expedite relief funding. The moral outrage was universal. People pointedly referenced how Karen's mania for aesthetics overshadowed basic human needs. Indeed, the temperature hovered around 10 degrees Fahrenheit at night, making heat a life-or-death matter for seniors or young children. All the while, I tried to help coordinate relief, distributing space heaters from a local charity, assisting the utilities engineers with pipeline safety guidelines, leveraging my connections to expedite certain shipments of replacement piping. Each day, neighbors approached me in gratitude and in sorrow, asking how we'd ever recover from this madness. The fiasco attracted national media attention. Networks arrived to film the battered community. Scenes of families bundled up indoors or loading cars to escape the cold splashed across TV screens. Talk shows debated HOA tyranny, referencing Karen's reckless disregard for safety. I gave a brief press conference clarifying the National Safety Board's advisory role. I avoided personal attacks, focusing on a universal lesson. Tampering with vital utilities is never acceptable. That publicity hammered Karen further. Online, outraged viewers demanded her arrest. Some threatened to dox her. Others labeled her Gaslight Karen, mocking her in viral memes. The intensity of public scorn was jarring. While I felt she deserved accountability, I worried about potential vigilantism. Hate mail reportedly piled up at her door. The crisis took on a life of its own. In the midst of all this, the official pipeline investigation progressed. The contractor Karen hired apparently wasn't licensed, using a fake business name. The unqualified workers admitted they had no specialized knowledge of gas lines. They cut them purely on Karen's insistence that it was authorized. That left her with nearly sole liability, an avalanche of evidence pointing to her direct instructions. Meanwhile, the recall meeting date loomed, with President Daniels anticipating a landslide vote to remove Karen. He also hinted that local authorities might file criminal charges for property damage and public endangerment. Some neighbors worried she might flee, but she remained holed up at her house, possibly in denial or shock. A week into the fiasco, gas restoration efforts made slow progress, but the utility had partially restored some lines. Many families still lacked full heat. Emotions ran high as the entire HOA membership assembled in the community hall for the recall vote. The place overflowed with frustrated residents, city officials, and a few reporters. President Daniels opened the meeting, voice trembling with anger. "We're here to address the catastrophic decision to cut gas lines, orchestrated by Vice President Hopkins. The board disavows any knowledge or approval of such an action. Ms. Hopkins acted unilaterally and illegally." The hush was deafening. Karen sat at a table near the front, face pale. Dozens lined up to speak. Each described the personal toll. Children sick from cold, elderly parents forced to relocate, skyrocketing repair costs. Some choked back tears, others seethed with rage. Finally, Karen was invited to respond. She rose unsteadily. I'm sorry for the hardship, but I maintain that I believe the lines were easily replaceable. My contractor insisted it would be done quickly. I had no idea it would spiral like this." She paused, voice cracking. "I never wanted to harm anyone. I only wanted to keep the neighborhood looking nice." Shouts of "too late" and "you nearly killed us" erupted. President Daniels called for order. Then the recall vote commenced, ballots distributed to each homeowner. The tension was thick. Within minutes, the results were tallied. An overwhelming majority, over 90%, favored removing Karen from the HOA board immediately. She slumped in her seat as the announcement was made. Motion passes. Ms. Hopkins is hereby recalled from her position as vice president and stripped of any HOA authority, effective immediately. Thunderous applause and cheers erupted. People hugged each other, some weeping in relief. The once untouchable Karen was dethroned. She stood, trembling, murmured, "I'm sorry," and fled the hall. Her reign ended. Even with Karen gone from the HOA, her troubles continued. Investigators wrapped up their final report, concluding that she'd willfully tampered with regulated gas lines without permits or professional oversight, knowingly endangering residents. The city attorney considered charges: vandalism, reckless endangerment, and possibly more. Civil lawsuits loomed, as multiple families demanded compensation for hotel bills, medical costs, or property damage. As for the board, they scrambled to handle the utilities' demands to cover repair expenses, some of it possibly falling on the HOA's insurance. Neighborhood finances were battered, prompting talk of a special assessment. Residents groaned, resenting that they might have to pay more because of Karen's folly. Some pointed out that Karen, personally, should be sued to recoup any funds. Time would tell if that route was pursued. Meanwhile, local news covered her downfall. The headlines: HOA Vice President recalled after gas sabotage, criminal charges possible. Karen faced relentless scrutiny. She rarely left home, presumably consulting lawyers. Rumors suggested she might sell her house and move away to escape the stigma. But legal accountability would follow her wherever she went. From my vantage, I saw this as a cautionary tale that soared beyond typical HOA spats. The moment personal arrogance collided with crucial infrastructure. Through my channels of the National Safety Board, I shared a special bulletin reinforcing that any modifications to gas lines require official approval, no exceptions. The fiasco at Hillcrest Oaks became a national example of what not to do. The silver lining: other HOAs around the country might learn from this tragedy. Over the following weeks, Hillcrest Oaks gradually recovered. The utility finished restoring every home's gas service. Temporary sidewalks and landscaping covered the trenches until spring, when more permanent repairs could be done. The atmosphere brightened once houses were heated and families returned from temporary shelters. President Daniels and the newly restructured HOA board committed to transparency and caution. They apologized for not stopping Karen sooner. They also instituted a safety oversight committee that had to approve any major infrastructure change, in consultation with city and utility experts. No more backroom decisions or secret midnight work crews. Neighbors expressed relief. "At least we're rid of Karen," Linda said. "Now we can focus on being a community again, not living under her tyranny." The sense of unity soared. People took extra steps to help one another, exchanging homemade meals, hosting block gatherings, and checking on seniors who'd endured the cold. The crisis, though painful, left a stronger bond in its wake. Meanwhile, I continued living quietly, albeit with my dignity fully out in the open. Some neighbors teased me about being a celebrity, but I insisted I was just doing my job. In truth, I was relieved that Maplewood Oaks was stabilizing, that I could finally enjoy the suburban peace I'd sought. Toby and Scout roamed the backyard again, no longer shivering indoors. As for Karen, I heard she eventually faced formal charges, though she struck a plea deal, reportedly paying hefty fines and restitution. She resigned from the HOA, listing her property for sale. Some said she left in the dark of night, ironically reminiscent of the same approach she used to cut her gas lines. Few shed tears for her departure. The neighborhood parted ways with a sigh of relief, ready for a kinder future. By late winter, the final pipeline repairs were done, yards were replanted, and a sense of normalcy returned. The fiasco over cut gas lines faded into memory, replaced by the typical suburban hum of kids playing, neighbors chatting, and seasonal festivities. People still occasionally cursed Karen under their breath, but the bitterness eased. One bright morning, the HOA board organized a community breakfast to celebrate the official reopening of the newly replaced gas line system. Local utility reps joined, proud to share the updated design, safely installed, properly permitted, and ideally less prone to external tampering. Residents clapped, grateful to see everything above board. I arrived with Toby and Scout bounding beside me, greeting neighbors who were layering bagels with cream cheese and sipping hot coffee. The mood was jubilant, a stark contrast to the fear and anger that once gripped the community. President Daniels pulled me aside, thanking me again for shining a national spotlight that accelerated repairs. "I wish I'd known your background earlier. Might have prevented this nightmare," he sighed. "But at least we learned from it." I nodded. "You did the right thing once you realized the danger." The neighborhood came together in the end. He gave a small smile, then excused himself to refill coffee cups. Looking around, I felt content. Despite the chaos Karen had unleashed, Hillcrest Oaks had not only survived, but emerged stronger, forging deeper unity. Gone were the days of ignoring fundamental safety for superficial aesthetics. Instead, a collective awareness prevailed. People's well-being must never be sacrificed for petty control. I knelt to pat Toby, reflecting on how a single HOA official's arrogance nearly brought disaster in the bleak midwinter. Yet with the right checks and balances plus a dash of national-level accountability. Common sense and community spirit prevailed. My job might be about safeguarding the entire country's infrastructure, but sometimes the biggest battles happen right in our own backyard. And that, truly, was a happy ending. A community restored, a misguided tyrant unseated, and a reaffirmation that no one, not even Karen, can override the fundamental needs and safety of neighbors, especially when the head of the National Safety Board lives just down the street.